The Denver Broncos offensive line must find ways to protect Russell Wilson or Brett Rypien, whoever is at quarterback. We take a look at the offensive line and the tinkering of the different lineups that has impacted chemistry. We take a look at key injuries that have impacted the Broncos offensive line, and we also forecast. We look into next season. Will the offensive line look the same? We ponder and we take a look at all that on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in and making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform or whether you watch on YouTube. From the South Stands to the end zone, I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Sayre, my friend, hey, look, we're on the aftermath of a Victory Monday episode of Locked on Broncos. If you didn't catch the Locked on Broncos post-game report of the Broncos' 24-15 victory against the Arizona Cardinals, make sure you go check that out as we speak here. But we have to look at some of the aftermath stuff, right? Some of the other things that warrant some concern going forward with just 3 games remaining on the year. And I think first and foremost, I think everybody in Broncos country will probably be in agreement when we say right now the biggest issue with this football team is the offensive line.
I would think so, Cody, and I think that a lot of people would agree with that. Like you mentioned, it's becoming apparent. And look, this is coming off of a week where, yes, the Broncos did run for more yards in the game against the Arizona Cardinals than they have in any other game this season. So that does deserve some kudos from the offensive line perspective. But at the same time, pass protection has been a problem all year. And I know that many people want to blame Russell Wilson. And I think there are times when Russell does deserve some blame for holding the ball too long or not throwing the ball away or not maybe having the best pocket presence. But at the same time, you see Brett Rypien out there the couple times that he's been out there. I know he went up against a really good defense, the Jets, earlier this season. But against the Arizona Cardinals, it was guys getting whipped on the interior. It was the interior offensive line really getting beat by some stunts, guys getting beat around the corner with speed, guys getting beat with power. Just the Cardinals were living in the backfield in the first half especially. And we saw, there was a lot of tweets out there, Cody. I saw a ton of them, and I'm sure the listeners, you all did as well, from people talking about, oh, well, just so you know, here's the NFL record for sacks in a game in case this comes up here in the second half, because that's how bad it was. The Broncos were on pace to certainly surrender a team franchise high, which I believe is 12 in a game. It didn't end up being that bad. It ended up being 7 sacks, but still 7 sacks in one game. That's pretty impressive from the Cardinals' perspective, especially because you had J.J. Watt out there looking like he was, hit the fountain of youth. He was playing like it was 2014. I just felt, Cody, and I think you feel all season, this unit, injuries have crushed it. It's been a revolving door out there. I think there's so much that needs to be changed with this team in the offseason, but I can't help but think offensive line has got to be at or near the top of the priority list.
After Sunday, during that game, Sayre, I don't know if Broncos country felt the same way. And if you did, make sure you tweet us on Twitter at CodyRoarkNFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked on Broncos. But I was thinking during the game, I was like, I'm so glad the Broncos held Russell Wilson out of this game, because the fact that obviously he suffered the concussion against the Chiefs, I couldn't imagine him taking some of the shots that Brett Rypien was. And realistically, like when the Arizona Cardinals pressure started to get home, it was when Dalton Risner exited with an elbow injury. And it's also when Quinn Miners left with an eye injury. So in return, the Broncos had to put Tom Compton at right guard. They had to put Luke Wattenberg for a moment at the left guard spot for Dalton Risner. Tom Compton got his lunch eaten by the Arizona Cardinals defense. And, it's unfortunate, I think, but there was a reason we haven't seen him play, right? But it's odd, though. I know, granted, he suffered a back injury in training camp, had to have surgery. the fact that we haven't really seen him until this dire situation with injuries is very, I'd say, revealing about maybe just, hey, he was a one-year guy. They probably didn't expect him to play really at all, and he did struggle. Unfortunately, he suffered another back injury in the Broncos win on Sunday. We'll find out his status this week from Broncos head coach Nathaniel Hackett. But for Brett Rypien in the first half to be sacked 6 times and have 8 quarterback hits against him in the first half, simply inexcusable, and you can't expect any quarterback, I don't care how tough you are, to withstand that. And we were thinking, as you mentioned, in the second half, if I'm the Broncos, I'm just going to come out and run the ball in the second half. Luckily, they did that, and it worked, and they obviously won the game. But I think it could be a different story against a defense like the Los Angeles Rams. Aaron Donald has missed some games for them. He could be back for the Broncos matchup on Christmas Day. And the only thing I'm thinking there is the offensive line has to be better. Granted, injuries have impacted that unit, especially on Sunday, but you can't let your quarterbacks take these amount of shots there. So we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into this as Russell Wilson and Denver quarterbacks need better protection. We talk about some of the other issues fundamentally that have impacted the offensive line and QB protection this year so far for this Broncos team. You'll get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But this episode of the show is brought to you by the Ultimate Football GM, and I'm really geeked out about our new partner and sponsor of today's episode, the mobile game, Ultimate Football GM. If you've ever dreamed about becoming an NFL GM or managing your football franchise, well, your dream can't come true, and this game is definitely for you. You get to manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through the season, and lead your team to glory. You're responsible for hiring the right coaches and the coordinators, trading players, making draft picks, navigating your franchise through free agency and the draft, and all the ups and downs of a season. All this in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline. Play on the go as you want, when you want to. Locked On Broncos listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code LOCKEDON in all caps in the game store. That's Locked On in all caps, so make sure you check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today, and our good friends over there at Turo. And Turo is the world's largest car-sharing marketplace. With Turo, you could book any car you want, wherever you want it, from a community of local hosts. Browse a huge selection of vehicles for just about any occasion or budget across the U.S., the UK, Canada, and Australia. Book a spacious SUV or minivan for a family road trip. Get a classic or luxury vehicle for a special event, birthday, or holiday. Find affordable economy cars if you're on a budget and just need to get from A to B. You can also test drive that new electric vehicle you've had your eye on to see how it fits in your everyday life. And many Turo hosts can even deliver the car right to you. Every trip is backed by liability insurance. Terms, conditions, and exclusions apply. Forget boring rental cars and find your drive at Turo.com. All right, Sayre, as we continue on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, taking a little bit of a deeper dive into where the issues on the offensive line have stemmed this season that have impacted Russell Wilson or Brett Rypien getting hit unnecessarily throughout this season. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day. And if you haven't made Locked On Broncos your first listen every day, here's why you should. Every single day, we bring you up-to-date news and coverage of all things Denver Broncos. I'm at every Broncos practice, every Broncos home and away game, minus Christmas this upcoming week here. And so you get all the up-to-date information from conversations that we have with coaches, with other media members, and also players inside the locker room. Locked On Broncos is the place to be for all your Broncos news, content coverage, and more. We're available on your favorite audio podcasting platform or on YouTube. Sayre, let's continue on today's episode of the show. I think one thing is for certain, and you and I have touched on this various times on the podcast, Russell Wilson and Denver quarterbacks, doesn't matter if it's Russ, Brett Rypien, Jarrett Guarantano, they need better protection. And part of this is also, in my opinion, Sayre, I feel like a coaching issue, right? We've had, I think, some elements of this season, especially on the offensive side of the ball, where, yes, player execution, injuries have impacted the Broncos, but coaching has also impacted the Broncos in a negative manner as well. And I can't help but just bring up the sore subject that right now, Butch Barry doesn't seem like a very favorable person in the eyes of Broncos country. Broncos fans are irate, and rightfully so. And there's just been some decisions that have been made, Sayre, as it pertains to the offensive line that have me agreeing with Broncos country here. They have consistently tinkered with the Broncos offensive line this season. Injuries have impacted that, but the Broncos coaching staff has seemingly played favorites with some guys. They've held some guys on shorter leashes versus other guys having a longer leash. To me, that is bad coaching.
I agree completely with you, Cody. I think that this reeks of certain things we've seen in the last, 5, 6, 7 years since the Broncos won the Super Bowl, right? It's really been a lot of these kind of little things that you notice throughout the season contributing to the team's woes on the grander scale. And I think that the offensive line is an area where, Butch Barry, he had some pretty big shoes to fill. Like Mike Munchak was very favorably looked upon by Broncos country, and rightfully so. He's one of the best offensive line coaches in the game. So then you go out and you replace him as one of your first things that you do as an NFL head coach. Speaking of Nathaniel Hackett here, and we've seen the results. They haven't been good. Like you said, the constant tinkering. Why was Calvin Anderson replaced in the starting lineup? You would think because Garrett Bowles has a broken leg, right? So you would think that going forward, Cam Fleming has less of a chance to be part of your team's future than does a younger player like Calvin Anderson, who's shown a lot of progress, a lot of upside, and not just potential at this point. Like I feel like he's kind of strung together some good performances at left tackle. We've seen him play well. So you slide Cam Fleming over from the right side when Billy Turner gets healthy in order to keep those two veterans on the field over Calvin Anderson, who's, he's playing his way into a potential future role. I just dislike that a lot. And I think the Netani Muti thing, Cody, we heard the reports from various people that Netani Muti chose the Las Vegas Raiders over the Denver Broncos. He had an opportunity to sign to the Broncos 53 at the, after the Raiders offered him the opportunity to go join them. He chose the Raiders. Really, that to me speaks directly to the coaches, because why would Netani Muti? We know Netani Muti, like you mentioned, he was making a huge impact in the community in Denver. Obviously, I don't think he has any problems with his teammates there.
No.
So certainly you would think that he chose the other team based on the coaching situation, which is fascinating because Josh McDaniels is notorious for being a coach that players are kind of afraid to be around. So I think that this speaks volumes to the fact that Butch Barry, this coaching staff, the offensive line has to be revisited in the offseason, because right now, what are your plans even for beyond this season, right? I mean, we can't even tell what the plan is for this season. It's like a basketball lineup. You just can't quite figure out who's your starting five. You can't figure out who's your best five. Injuries only play so much of a role there, Cody, to me, because you are making shuffles when they're not necessary. You're not bringing Netani Muti up to the 53 when you clearly have issues staying healthy on the interior. I just think all of these things are bad. It's just bad. It looks bad. It makes the team look bad. And then obviously you have a situation like you did on Sunday against the Cardinals where you need interior linemen and Muti's not there to help you this time. So it's just one of those things where you look at the season as a whole. I think the treatment of the offensive line by the coaching staff is one of the biggest things you could point to if the staff is, removed at the end of the season.
Well, and that's the thing that's the most frustrating to me, especially like with Calvin Anderson, as you mentioned, like for what we've seen on tape from him, pretty solid at pass protection. Now, there was a time against Kansas City Chiefs where a defender came free. There was a miscommunication between Calvin and obviously the left guard at that point to his right, which was Dalton Reiser, based on how a defensive lineman was lined up in the apex between Calvin and Dalton. They brought an edge defender off clean. So obviously some miscommunication stuff. But outside of that, when we look at one-on-one reps in pass protection, Calvin Anderson's done a pretty dang good job. He's given Russell Wilson and quarterbacks time. And also in the run game, he's been able to set some things up as well. In my opinion, I just think that it is so evident, clear as day, when it comes to certain guys. Like, for some reason, like Calvin Anderson was getting all the first-team reps at right tackle in training camp and preseason and things like that, and was even playing deep into the preseason when most other starters were not. It's clear that Butch Barry, there's something that he does not like about Calvin, because he has this tendency to just go with Cam Fleming, who Cam was playing at the right tackle spot while Billy Turner came back. Okay, so they slid Cam Fleming to the left tackle spot and derailed Calvin, who's been playing pretty well there. So it's like, if you want your offensive line to play better, why are you constantly changing things where guys are playing and having success? Why are you constantly tinkering with it? To me, it is inexcusable. But here's what I would do, Sayre. Quinn Miners will be day-to-day this week for the Broncos after suffering an eye injury that forced him to leave the stadium to go get checked out by an eye specialist. If he has to miss any time, Why not just slide Cam Fleming to right guard next to Billy Turner and place Calvin Anderson at left tackle? To me, that makes sense. That's probably not what's going to happen, though. We'll probably see Luke Wattenberg. And I will say this, Luke Wattenberg, when he got thrown in at left guard, he struggled. Then when he moved to right guard after Tom Compton got hurt, I actually watched him in some one-on-one reps. I thought he actually did a better job. So I guess if there's a silver lining, anything we want to put on it, I think there's that. And especially for a guy like Luke Wattenberg, I asked Nathaniel Hackett last week about this. How do you keep his confidence high after, he's been thrown into some situations and has struggled? And he said that, we as a coaching staff, we could have done a better job at putting him in a better position to succeed. And so for Hackett to mention that, I'm not saying that there's dissension or anything like that, but it's like, it's really evident that Butch Barry has his guys. And I think that in the NFL, while you can have your guys that you like, I think when it messes with the offense and I think when it messes with chemistry, I think it's a flaw. It is a huge time flaw. And I don't think Butch Barry will be back for the Broncos next season. It's frustrating to see how things have transpired on the offensive line with injuries, but also things that are in their control as to like who is in the starting lineup and who is not. So it's something we'll have to keep our eye on going forward. And as we look forward, we're going to take a look at the future of the Broncos offensive line. What might the offensive line look like for this Denver Broncos team going into the 2023 NFL season? That is something you'll get on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But this episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at PrizePicks. And with the PrizePicks app, you choose 2 to 5 players that you're focused on heading into the week. And these players, they'll have a projection that's set by PrizePicks. And you simply choose whether or not they will have more or less than their PrizePicks projection suggests, which could allow you to win 10 times your money on any entry. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections that are available. Download the PrizePicks app or go to PrizePicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. And first-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, PrizePicks will give you $50. Don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Which players on the Broncos offensive line will be back or will not be back in the 2023 NFL season? We play a little bit of a flash forward as we project that on today's episode. Locked On Broncos, available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format or whether you watch on YouTube. Broncos Country, thank you so much for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. Sayre, this is going to be a very, very interesting offseason for this Broncos football team. As we all know, the season not ideal. I mean, I think we all expected the Broncos to be above 500, competing for a playoff spot, maybe competing for the division before the season. Sadly, that is not how it's gone. Kansas City's already locked up the division in Week 15. They've already clinched it, so that means that Denver will not have a chance to. But I think there's some things to look forward to. Obviously, a Christmas Day game with the Los Angeles Rams. They travel to Kansas City the next week, and then they close out the season against the Los Angeles Chargers in a game where the Broncos could potentially spoil the Chargers' chances at a wild card spot in the playoffs. So I think there's still a lot of things to play for this season for this Broncos team. But let's take a look at the offensive line here, Sayre. I mean, when we look at it right now, the starting offensive line coming into the season, Garrett Bowles at left tackle, Dalton Reisner at left guard, Lloyd Cushenberry at center, and then at right guard, you had Quinn Miners, right tackle. Cam Fleming got to start week 1 against the Seahawks. But ideally, you were hoping that was going to be Billy Turner as your starter at right tackle. What will the offensive line look like next year? So let's take a look at the key guys. I think we start off with Quinn Miners. Quinn Miners, in my opinion, I think seems like a core guy for the Broncos offensive line. I think that he's an easy shoe-in to be back and also to be starting next season for Denver.
I completely agree with that, Cody. And I think that Quinn Miners has kind of proven that, especially as we saw when he went out of the game against the Arizona Cardinals. What was the first thing that happened, right? I mean, obviously, J.J. Watt comes knifing through the middle of that line right where Quinn Miners used to be and made a big play. So Quinn Miners, to me, has been a very good pick by George Paton. Obviously, a third-round pick in 2021. He's going to be going into year 3 next year. Keep in mind, too, he was coming from, one of the most obscure colleges for any player to ever get drafted from when he was coming out in 2021. And then in the year before that, remember, they didn't even have really a season, right? He was lifting logs in the forest because there was no football season for him in 2020. So he's out there learning on the fly, but at the same time, I think he's proven he might be the Broncos' best offensive lineman. I know we talked about that early on in the season. Then he had the injury and went out. Who hasn't had an injury for the Denver Broncos this year? It's kind of been a wild and crazy year for that. But I think you're right. I think he is a core player going forward. What the Broncos really have to decide in the 2023 offseason, that's going to be fascinating to see, because I don't know what their alternatives really are, right? And obviously you only have so many assets that you can utilize in the draft or money that you can spend in free agency. Where does this team view Garrett Bowles is going to be one of the best questions to follow in the offseason, I guess, for lack of a better term there. I think it's going to be intriguing to see because he's coming off a broken leg. He has a very big cap number going forward. So what's going to happen there? Is he going to be asked to restructure? Is he going to be asked to kind of do the team a solid in terms of maybe kicking some of that money down the road? I'll be interested to see where the team is at with Garrett Bowles and where Garrett Bowles is kind of at in terms of, I really want to be in Denver, so I'm willing to do whatever. Or is he going to be like, no, you're going to either pay me what I'm due or you can cut me loose and I'll go to another team? I'll be fascinated to find that out, because I think that his situation could determine the rest of the course of the offseason, at least in part, right? Because left tackle is such a big position in the NFL. Right tackle is anymore these days as well. But Garrett Bowles, obviously a proven guy for the Broncos, at least an above average offensive tackle at the very least, even on his bad days most times these days. So, Cody, to me, the Garrett Bowles situation is going to be one that's worth monitoring throughout the offseason.
Well, the question is, too, do they ask him to restructure? I mean, coming off a serious injury like that, I know Garrett loves being in Denver. He loves the Broncos. He loves his teammates. But when you get asked sometimes, I think that, hey, can you restructure your deal? Sometimes players are hesitant. But I will point out, like, Graham Glasgow is a perfect example. He's been asked to restructure his deal twice to stay in Denver and has done that. So I think that when you look at a guy like Glasgow being as selfless as he is to do that in a situation where he necessarily didn't have to, but he wanted to stay in Denver, I think that's something he can continue to build on as well. We'll see if, Garrett Bowles does that. Let's take a look now at Dalton Risner. I think this is a question, right? Because we all know he has not heard from the Broncos, or his agent has not heard from the Broncos on any extension. I think it's evident. We saw it clear as day, unless there's a better plan out there in free agency, a bigger target that the Broncos have for a potential left guard. Dalton could be back maybe on a 1 or 2 year deal for this Denver team, but I think so much is going to be contingent upon if the Broncos make a change at coach, right? A head coach, offensive coordinator. Obviously, that means there's going to be a brand new offensive line coach more than likely coming in. I think so much of this, it's hard to project until or if some of these things happen, right? Like, I don't think we really truly think about the magnitude of the changes in the offseason. So much, like, we can say, okay, in free agency, this should be the main target for the Broncos. But so much will be contingent upon whether or not that player is a fit for the scheme of the coaching staff. And as we anticipate, more than likely Denver will have an entirely new coaching staff. We will see how things go here. Risner could possibly be back, but this is an interesting one, Sayre, and I'm eager for your thoughts on it. Lloyd Cushenberry, still under contract, but in my opinion, I don't think he's a starter at center. I think he lacks a lot of physical strength. I think he's a smart football player, but he physically gets manhandled to the point where he simply has not worked out for the Broncos, where I think every year since he's been in the NFL, Denver has either drafted or brought somebody in through free agency to kind of compete at center a little bit. I'm eager for your thoughts on Cushenberry and Risner.
Yeah, well, I think with Risner, I think you should bring him back on a 1 to 2 year deal. He just means so much to the community, so much to the organization. I think at the very least, if he's your Walter Payton Man of the Year nominee, I feel like you bring that guy back, right? I feel like he's an important piece to your locker room. He obviously loves the Broncos. He loves Denver. He's a Colorado guy. So I think you bring back Dalton Risner, although I wouldn't say you necessarily give him, $14 million a year or something like that, or whatever interior linemen are making these days out on the open market, at least in the top tier. I would say it's kind of like a Josie Jewell situation. Remember when he was coming off injury, the Broncos gave him a 2-year deal to come back. And at the time, a lot of fans were kind of wondering, why the heck did they bring Josie Jewell back? Inside linebackers, this team's biggest need, blah, blah, blah. Well, Josie Jewell has turned out to be one of the team's best defensive players. Let's just say that. So I think Dalton Risner deserves an opportunity to come back. Like we talked about, really great rookie season, kind of took a step back in 2020. And then I think in 2021, we saw him kind of creeping forward a little bit, getting a little bit better. 2022, I don't know. I guess we'll have to kind of find out. But to me, I think you bring him back. Lloyd Cushenberry, Cody, I'm with you. I think that in today's NFL, versatility is everything for offensive linemen. You have to be able to play multiple positions, and if he doesn't offer you an opportunity to play the guard position, or if he's not physical enough, I just don't see the path to him being back unless it's just as a backup center, right? You want specifically a backup center, a guy that's got experience, a guy that could come in. I think that's valuable. He is under contract next season, which the Broncos might as well keep him around, but I think you bring in somebody to take that job, signing somebody in free agency or maybe drafting someone relatively high. Although I would prefer free agency at this point, Cody. Get somebody who's out there proven, who can play the position, what you're going to get from them, and who's physical, more physical at the point of attack. I think the Broncos do need that. So I see Cushenberry back next year, but as the backup center for sure.
Broncos country, let us know your thoughts on what you think the offensive line will look like. Who will be back? Who do you think will not be back for the team next season? We're eager for your thoughts. Drop those in the YouTube comment section or tweet us on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. But that'll wrap up today's episode of the show on your favorite audio podcasting platform, or whether you watch on YouTube. Sayre and I will be back for a brand new episode of the show tomorrow as we take a look at some of the underrated defensive players that have stepped up. We all know Draymond Jones is out for the remainder of the season. How did Inyoma Uwazurike, Deshaun Williams, and other players step up? Not to mention Damari Mathis, looking like an absolute stud right now for George Paton and this Broncos football team, playing impact minutes, starting opposite of Patrick Surtain. We dive deeper into that on tomorrow's episode, Locked On Broncos.